The man lying in that Madrid palace bed was, by any medical standard, a miracle of survival. Charles II of Spain had been expected to die as an infant, then as a child, then as a teenager. For 38 years, the courts of Europe had been placing bets on when not if he would finally succumb. And now, on the 1st of November in the year 1700, the betting was finally over. The King of Spain was dead, and the moment his heart stopped beating, every major power on earth began preparing for war. Because Charles II hadn't just been the King of Spain. He had been the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. An empire that stretched from the Philippines to the Netherlands, from Sicily to Peru, from Milan to Mexico. An empire that controlled the flow of silver from the New World, dominated Mediterranean trade, and held strategic territories on 4 continents. Whoever inherited this empire would become, overnight, the most powerful person on the planet. And Charles II had no children, no brothers, no obvious heir. His death didn't just create a succession crisis. It created a power vacuum so vast that it threatened to swallow Europe whole. Within months, armies would be marching. Within years, battles would be fought on 3 continents simultaneously. Before it was over, somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 soldiers would be dead. Borders would be redrawn across the globe, and the entire balance of power would shift in ways that would shape world history for the next 3 centuries. This is the story of the War of Spanish Succession, the war for the world. A war that started because one inbred king couldn't produce an heir and ended up determining which nations would dominate the modern age. It is, quite possibly, the most important war you've never heard of. To understand how Charles II's death could trigger a global catastrophe, you first have to understand Charles II himself. And to understand Charles II, you have to understand what centuries of royal inbreeding can do to a human body. The Spanish Habsburgs had ruled Spain since 1516, and they had a particular fondness for keeping power in the family, a very particular fondness. Over nearly 200 years, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty had intermarried so extensively that their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot. Uncles married nieces, first cousins married first cousins. The same ancestors appeared multiple times in the same person's lineage. By the time Charles II was born in 1661, the genetic consequences were catastrophic. Charles was so inbred that his ancestry was, by one calculation, more concentrated than if his parents had been brother and sister. His father, Philip IV, was his mother's uncle. His grandmother was also his aunt. Going back just a few generations, the same individuals appeared in his family tree over and over, compressing the genetic diversity to almost nothing. The result was a man barely capable of survival, let alone rule. Contemporary accounts describe Charles in terms that are difficult to read. His head was too large for his body. His jaw was so malformed, the famous Habsburg jaw taken to its extreme, that he could barely chew food. His tongue was so oversized that he drooled constantly and was difficult to understand when he spoke. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. He was subject to seizures, digestive problems, and what contemporaries called melancholy, what we might today recognize as significant cognitive impairment. He was also, somehow, expected to rule the mightiest empire on earth. Charles II was called many things during his life, but the nickname that stuck was El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Many Spaniards genuinely believed that Charles's condition must be the result of demonic possession or dark magic, because the alternative that the royal family had destroyed their own bloodline through generations of incest was too terrible to contemplate. And yet, against all odds, Charles survived. Year after year, defying every prediction, he clung to life and to his throne. He married twice, desperately hoping to produce an heir who could resolve the succession question, but both marriages were childless. Whether due to his physical condition, his possible sterility, or simple biological incompatibility, the King of Spain would never have children. As Charles entered his 30s, still childless, the courts of Europe began circling like vultures. Because if Charles died without an heir, and he clearly would die without an heir someone would have to inherit. And given the scale of what was at stake, that question couldn't be left to chance. The Spanish Empire of 1700 was not what it had been in the glory days of Philip II. It had been weakened by decades of expensive wars, economic mismanagement, and the slow drain of maintaining territories scattered across the globe. But it was still enormous, still wealthy, still a prize worth fighting for. In Europe alone, Spain controlled not just the Iberian Peninsula, but also the Spanish Netherlands, modern Belgium, and Luxembourg, significant portions of Italy, including Milan, Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, and various other strategic territories. In the Americas, Spain controlled Mexico, Central America, most of South America, the Caribbean islands, Florida, and vast unexplored territories. In Asia, Spain held the Philippines and maintained trade networks that connected 3 continents. The revenues from American silver mines alone made Spain one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, even in decline. And the strategic position of Spanish territories controlling key choke points in the Mediterranean, dominating the Low Countries, commanding the Atlantic trade routes meant that whoever controlled Spain could potentially dominate Europe. The question was, who would that be? There were 2 main candidates, and both had equally valid claims to the throne. Both were related to Charles II through his sisters, who had married into other royal houses. And both candidates represented dynasties that would fundamentally reshape European power if they gained control of Spain. The first candidate was Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of King Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV was, at this moment, the most powerful monarch in Europe. He had spent the past for decades building France into a colossus, fighting wars against virtually every neighbor, expanding French territory, and establishing the model of absolute monarchy that other kings would try to emulate. He was called the Sun King, and his court at Versailles was the wonder of the age. Philip of Anjou was Louis's second grandson, close enough to the French throne to matter, distant enough that his claim to Spain wouldn't automatically merge the 2 crowns. His grandmother, Maria Theresa, had been Charles II's half-sister. That gave Philip a legitimate blood claim to the Spanish inheritance. But here was the problem. If Philip became king of Spain, the 2 greatest powers in Western Europe, France and Spain, would be ruled by the same family. The Bourbons would control everything from the Pyrenees to the Philippines. The balance of power that had kept Europe in rough equilibrium for 2 centuries would be shattered. France, already dominant, would become unstoppable. The second candidate was Archduke Charles of Austria, the younger son of the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I. Leopold was a Habsburg, the same dynasty that had ruled Spain for nearly 200 years. The Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs were 2 branches of the same family, and Leopold argued that the Spanish throne should remain within the broader Habsburg family rather than passing to the French Bourbons. His son Charles had a claim through his grandmother, who had also been a Spanish princess, but the Austrian option had its own terrifying implications. If Charles became king of Spain, the Habsburg dynasty would control both the Spanish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, recreating, in effect, the domain of the Emperor Charles V, who had ruled both in the early 16th century. That combination of power had nearly overwhelmed Europe before. No one wanted to see it return, so Europe faced a dilemma with no good options. A Bourbon on the Spanish throne meant French dominance. A Habsburg on the Spanish throne meant Austrian dominance. Either choice would upset the balance of power catastrophically. There was one potential solution: partition. What if, Instead of giving the entire Spanish Empire to one candidate, the powers of Europe simply divided it up. France could take some territories, Austria could take others. Everyone else could grab whatever pieces they could negotiate. Spain itself might go to one candidate, but with its empire stripped away, reducing the danger of any single power becoming too dominant. This is, in fact, what the major powers tried to do. In 1698 and again in 1700, France, England, and the Dutch Republic negotiated partition treaties that would have divided the Spanish inheritance among multiple claimants. It was cynical, it was calculating, and it completely ignored the wishes of Spain itself, but it might have prevented a catastrophic war. There was just one problem: the Spanish weren't interested in being carved up. Charles II, despite his disabilities, was not a fool. He understood perfectly well that the vultures were circling, that foreign powers were negotiating to dismember his empire before he was even dead, and he was determined to prevent it. In the months before his death, Charles made his decision. He would leave a will. That will would name a single heir to the entire Spanish Empire undivided, intact, in one piece. And that heir would be Philip of Anjou, the French candidate. Why Philip? The reasons were complex. Charles's advisors believed that only France had the military power to defend the Spanish Empire against partition. The Austrian Habsburgs were weaker, more distracted by conflicts in the East, less capable of projecting power across multiple continents. If Spain was to remain whole, it needed a protector. And the only realistic protector was Louis XIV. There was also a condition: the crowns of France and Spain must never be united. Philip would renounce any claim to the French throne. The two kingdoms would remain separate, even if ruled by members of the same dynasty. This, Charles and his advisors hoped, would address the concerns about a single Bourbon superstate. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died. His will was opened. Philip of Anjou was proclaimed King of Spain. The question now was, what would Louis XIV do? Louis XIV faced a choice that would determine the fate of Europe. He could accept the will, recognize his grandson as Philip V of Spain, and unite the two kingdoms in a dynastic alliance that would make the Bourbons the dominant force in Europe. This would mean war almost certainly. The other powers would never accept such a concentration of power without a fight. Or he could honor the partition treaties, take a portion of the Spanish Empire for France, and allow the rest to be divided among the other claimants. This would maintain the balance of power and likely prevent a general war. But it would mean giving up the greatest prize in European politics, the entire Spanish Empire, when it was being offered freely. Louis chose the will. Of course he did. He was Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who had spent his entire reign expanding French power at every opportunity. He wasn't going to turn down an empire. On November 16, 1700, Louis presented his grandson to the French court with the words, "Gentlemen, here is the King of Spain." Philip departed for Madrid, where he was welcomed as Philip V. The Spanish Empire, intact and undivided, passed into Bourbon hands. And then Louis made a series of decisions that guaranteed war. First, he made it clear that Philip's renunciation of the French throne was meaningless. Louis publicly stated that Philip retained his rights to succeed in France, raising the specter of an eventual union of the two crowns. The nightmare scenario that everyone had feared was now openly being threatened. Second, Louis sent French troops into the Spanish Netherlands, occupying key fortresses and establishing French military control over territory that sat directly on the border of the Dutch Republic. The Dutch had spent generations and rivers of blood ensuring that the Spanish Netherlands didn't fall into French hands. Now Louis was taking them anyway. Third, Louis secured for French merchants exclusive rights to the lucrative slave trade with Spanish America, the so-called Jacinto. This struck directly at English and Dutch commercial interests, threatening their access to markets they had spent decades developing. Fourth, and perhaps most provocatively, Louis recognized the son of the exiled James II of England as the rightful king of England. James II had been overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, replaced by William III and Mary. His son, James III, to his supporters, was a Catholic pretender with no real power. But Louis's recognition was a direct insult to William III and to the Protestant succession in England, a declaration that France considered the English government illegitimate. By the spring of 1701, any hope of avoiding war had evaporated. Louis XIV hadn't just accepted the Spanish inheritance, he had rubbed everyone's faces in it. He had threatened Dutch security, English commerce, Austrian claims, and the entire European balance of power in a matter of months. The response was inevitable. On September 7, 1701, three powers signed the Treaty of The Hague, forming what would become known as the Grand Alliance. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire agreed to make war on France until the threat of Bourbon dominance was broken. Their goals were ambitious: strip Spain of its European territories, prevent the union of the French and Spanish crowns, and restore the balance of power that Louis XIV had so brazenly upset. Over the following months, other powers joined the alliance. Portugal switched sides, enticed by English promises and threats. Savoy, initially aligned with France, would later defect. Various German states contributed troops. Even Denmark provided soldiers for the coalition armies. Against this formidable alliance, France and Spain stood largely alone. They had the advantage of interior lines, the wealth of the Spanish Empire, and the finest army in Europe. Louis XIV had been preparing for this kind of war his entire reign. His forces were veteran, well-equipped, and commanded by experienced generals. The stage was set for a conflict that would span continents and last over a decade. Armies would clash from the plains of Bavaria to the hills of Portugal, from the waters of the Caribbean to the forests of North America. Hundreds of thousands of men would march, fight, and die over the question of who would sit on the Spanish throne. But what neither side could have predicted was that this war would produce military geniuses who would transform the art of warfare itself, and battles that would become legends studied by officers for centuries to come. The man who would become the face of the Allied war effort was an unlikely hero. John Churchill had been born into a minor English noble family without significant wealth or powerful connections. He had risen through the ranks of the English military through a combination of genuine talent, political maneuvering, and what even his enemies admitted was personal charm of a very high order. He was handsome, intelligent, and utterly ruthless when circumstances required. By 1702, Churchill had been created Duke of Marlborough and appointed commander of the combined Anglo-Dutch forces. He was 52 years old, experienced but not yet legendary. That was about to change. Marlborough possessed a combination of qualities that made him uniquely suited for the war ahead. He was a superb tactician, capable of reading a battlefield and identifying the decisive moment with uncanny precision. He was an equally superb strategist, understanding how individual battles fit into the larger political picture. And perhaps most importantly for coalition warfare, he was a diplomat of extraordinary skill, capable of managing the fragile egos and competing interests of allies who often hated each other as much as they hated France. The Allied forces Marlborough commanded were not a unified army. They were a patchwork of English, Dutch, German, Danish, and other contingents, each with its own officers, its own supply systems, its own political masters back home. Keeping this coalition together while also winning battles was a feat of management that would have defeated lesser commanders. Marlborough was not a lesser commander, but he wouldn't be working alone. Across the continent, serving the Austrian Habsburgs, was another military genius who would prove to be Marlborough's perfect complement. Prince Eugene of Savoy was, in many ways, Marlborough's opposite. Where Marlborough was charming and politically adept, Eugene was blunt and impatient with court intrigue. Where Marlborough had risen through the English establishment, Eugene had been rejected by it. He had actually applied to serve in the French army as a young man and been turned down by Louis XIV himself, a rejection that Eugene would spend his career making Louis regret. Eugene had joined the Austrian Habsburg forces and had proven himself in wars against the Ottoman Turks, earning a reputation as one of the finest commanders of his generation. He was fearless in battle, leading from the front with a personal courage that inspired his troops and occasionally terrified his staff. Separately, Marlborough and Eugene were dangerous. Together, they would prove unstoppable. The first years of the war established the pattern that would define the conflict. In the Spanish Netherlands and along the Rhine, Marlborough and the Allied forces faced French armies commanded by capable marshals men like Villeroy, Boufflers, and Vendôme. The fighting was characterized by sieges, maneuvers, and the kind of cautious chess game warfare that was typical of the era. Neither side could afford catastrophic defeats, so both sides were careful. In Italy, Eugene fought a separate campaign against French and Spanish forces, struggling with inadequate resources and political interference from Vienna. He won victories, suffered setbacks, and kept Austrian hopes alive through sheer determination. In Spain itself, the situation was complicated. Philip V was genuinely popular in much of Spain, particularly in Castile. The Spanish people hadn't chosen partition, they wanted their empire intact, and Philip offered that. But the Kingdom of Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia increasingly supported the rival claimant, Archduke Charles, who arrived in Spain in 1704 to press his claim. Spain descended into civil war, with foreign armies intervening on both sides. And across the Atlantic, in the Americas, the colonial powers fought their own version of the conflict. Known in the English colonies as Queen Anne's War, Queen Anne had succeeded William III in 1702. This struggle saw raids, skirmishes, and naval battles from New England to the Caribbean. Native American allies were drawn into the conflict on both sides. It was a true world war, fought on multiple continents simultaneously. But the decisive theater would be Germany, and the decisive year would be 1704. By the spring of 1704, the war had reached a crisis point that threatened to unravel the entire Allied coalition. The problem was Bavaria. Maximilian II Emmanuel, the Elector of Bavaria, had sided with France. This was a disaster. Bavaria sat in the heart of Germany, directly between French territory and the Austrian heartland. With Bavarian support, French armies could march straight down the Danube and threaten Vienna, itself the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, the seat of Habsburg power, the heart of the alliance. And that's exactly what the French planned to do. A combined Franco-Bavarian army under Marshal Marzin and the Elector himself was assembling in Bavaria, preparing for an offensive that would knock Austria out of the war entirely. If Vienna fell, the Grand Alliance would collapse, the Dutch would sue for peace. England would have to accept whatever terms Louis XIV offered. The war would be over and the Bourbons would win. Marlborough saw the danger clearly. The Allies needed to reinforce the Austrian front immediately. But he was in the Netherlands, hundreds of miles from Bavaria, and the Dutch, his nominal allies, were terrified of weakening their own defenses. They refused to authorize any movement of troops away from the Low Countries. What Marlborough did next would become one of the most celebrated military maneuvers in European history. He lied. Marlborough told the Dutch that he intended to campaign along the Moselle River, a reasonable enough objective that would keep his forces relatively close to the Netherlands while threatening French territory. The Dutch approved. Marlborough marched south, and then he kept marching past the Moselle, past the Rhine, deeper and deeper into Germany, covering nearly 250 miles in 5 weeks. It was a logistics miracle. Marlborough had pre-positioned supplies along the route, arranged fresh shoes for his soldiers at key points, coordinated with German allies to provide food and fodder. His army arrived in Bavaria not exhausted and depleted, but fresh and ready to fight. By the time the Dutch realized what he had done, it was too late to stop him. Marlborough was in Bavaria, linking up with Prince Eugene's Austrian forces and preparing to engage the enemy. The Sun King's marshals suddenly had a very serious problem. The Franco-Bavarian army was encamped near a small village called Blind Anglicized in history as Blenheim. It was a strong position, anchored on the Danube River and protected by streams and marshland. The French commander, Marshal Tallard, had roughly 60,000 troops. He was confident, perhaps too confident. When Tallard saw the Allied army approaching on the morning of August 13, 1704, he reportedly remarked that the enemy was delivering themselves into his hands. He would destroy them today and march on Vienna by the end of the month. Marlborough and Eugene had other plans. The Allied force was slightly smaller than the Franco-Bavarian army, roughly 52,000 men. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Marlborough and Eugene had spent days planning their attack, coordinating their movements with the kind of precise synchronization that was rare in an age of slow communications and difficult terrain. The battle began in the late morning. Eugene's Austrians attacked on the right, engaging the Bavarian forces and preventing them from reinforcing the French center. It was brutal, bloody fighting, and Eugene's forces took heavy casualties, but they held. They pinned down an entire wing of the enemy army. Meanwhile, Marlborough prepared his main assault against the French center and left. The fighting around Blenheim village itself became a catastrophe for the French. Tallard had packed too many troops into the village, 27 battalions, far more than could effectively be used in the confined space. These soldiers became trapped, unable to maneuver, unable to support the rest of the French line. Marlborough contained them with a fraction of his force and focused his main strength elsewhere. In the center, Marlborough massed his cavalry. At the critical moment, as the French line began to waver, he personally led the charge. What followed was devastation. The French center collapsed. Tallard's army broke into fragments, some fleeing, some surrendering, some drowning in the Danube as they tried to escape. The troops trapped in Blenheim village, still 20,000 strong, were surrounded and forced to surrender en masse. By nightfall, the Franco-Bavarian army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Nearly 30,000 French and Bavarian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Marshal Tallard himself was taken prisoner. The threat to Vienna was eliminated in a single afternoon. The Battle of Blenheim was the worst defeat suffered by a French army in over a century. It shattered the myth of French military invincibility. It saved Austria from conquest. And it announced to all of Europe that the Duke of Marlborough was a commander of the first rank, perhaps the finest general of his age. When Marlborough sent news of the victory to his wife, Sarah, he scribbled a quick note on the back of a tavern bill. "I have not time to say more, but to beg you will give my duty to the Queen, and let her know her army has had a glorious victory." Glorious indeed. Blenheim changed everything. The years following Blenheim saw the Allies press their advantage across multiple theaters. In 1706, Marlborough won another crushing victory at Ramillies in the Spanish Netherlands. The battle lasted barely 2 hours. The French army lost over 15,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. More importantly, the entire Spanish Netherlands collapsed into Allied hands. Cities that had resisted French influence for decades suddenly threw open their gates to the victorious Duke. Within weeks, nearly all of modern-day Belgium was under Allied control. Marlborough's reputation reached almost mythical proportions. French soldiers spoke of him with a mixture of hatred and terrified respect. Louis XIV cycled through commander after commander, searching desperately for someone who could match the English Duke on the battlefield. No one could. In Italy, Eugene achieved similar success. His 1706 campaign culminated in the relief of Turin, breaking the French siege and effectively ending French influence in northern Italy. The fighting was fierce. Eugene was wounded during the assault, but the result was decisive. Italy, like the Netherlands, was slipping from Bourbon control. Even in Spain, the Allied cause seemed to be prospering. Archduke Charles had established himself in Barcelona and controlled much of Aragon and Catalonia. Allied forces briefly captured Madrid itself in 1706, forcing Philip V to flee his own capital. It seemed possible, even likely, that the entire Bourbon position would collapse, and yet it didn't. The problem was Spain itself. Despite military setbacks, Philip V remained genuinely popular among ordinary Spaniards, particularly in Castile, the heartland of the kingdom. When Allied forces occupied Madrid, they found a hostile population that viewed them as foreign invaders rather than liberators. Partisan resistance harassed supply lines. Guerrilla fighters attacked isolated units. The occupation became untenable. Philip returned to Madrid within months. The pattern repeated in 1710, when Allied forces again captured the capital only to be forced out by popular resistance and overextended supply lines. Spain refused to be conquered. There was a deeper problem, too. The Allied coalition was fighting for Archduke Charles, but Charles wasn't Spanish. He didn't speak Spanish fluently. He was surrounded by German and English advisors who often showed contempt for Spanish customs and sensibilities. Even Spaniards who disliked Philip V sometimes preferred him to a foreign-backed pretender. The war for Spain was becoming unwinnable. Not because of French arms, but because the Spanish people had made their choice. Meanwhile, on the main battlefields of the Netherlands and Germany, the war ground on. Marlborough and Eugene continued their partnership, winning battles that would be studied in military academies for centuries. At Oudenarde in 1708, they caught a French army in a meeting engagement, a chance encounter that turned into a full-scale battle and inflicted another devastating defeat. The French lost nearly 20,000 men. Allied casualties were around 3,000. After Oudenarde, the Allies invaded France itself, besieging the fortress of Lille, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Europe and a symbol of Louis XIV's earlier conquests. The siege lasted months and cost thousands of lives, but Lille eventually fell. For the first time, French territory was being stripped away. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was facing the possibility of actual defeat. His treasury was exhausted. His armies were beaten. His people were starving. The terrible winter of 1708 to 1709, known as Le Grand Hiver, killed hundreds of thousands of French peasants through cold and famine. France was bleeding to death. In the spring of 1709, Louis sent diplomats to the Allies with an extraordinary offer. He would accept virtually all their demands. Philip V would renounce the Spanish throne. The Spanish Empire would be partitioned. French territorial gains from the past decades would be surrendered. Louis XIV, the proudest monarch in Europe, was ready to capitulate? The Allies should have taken the deal. They didn't. Drunk on victory, convinced that total triumph was within reach, the Allied negotiators added one more demand. Louis must personally use French troops to remove his own grandson from the Spanish throne. If Philip refused to leave, Louis must make war on his own family. It was a humiliation to far. Louis rejected the terms and made a famous appeal to his people. Since I must make war, I prefer to wage it against my enemies rather than against my children. France rallied. The war continued. The Battle of Malplaquet, fought on September 11, 1709, showed what this stubborn continuation would cost. By raw numbers, it was an Allied victory. Marlborough and Eugene attacked a French army under Marshal Villars near the Belgian border and eventually forced them to retreat. The French position was captured. The Allied advance continued, but the price was horrifying. The Allies lost somewhere between 21,000 and 24,000 men killed and wounded. French losses were around 11,000, less than half the Allied casualties. In brutal terms, Malplaquet was a disaster for the victors. Villars, though wounded in the battle, reportedly told Louis XIV, "If God gives us another such defeat, Your Majesty's enemies will be destroyed." He wasn't entirely wrong. The Allied nations, England, the Dutch Republic, the German states were growing exhausted. Public enthusiasm for the war was fading. The costs were mounting. And each victory seemed to bring peace no closer. In England, particularly, political winds were shifting. The war had always been, in part, a political conflict within England itself. The Whig Party supported the war enthusiastically. They represented commercial interests that benefited from weakening France, Protestant fervor that opposed the Catholic Bourbons, and a vision of England as a great European power. Marlborough was closely aligned with the Whigs, and his wife, Sarah, was the intimate confidant of Queen Anne herself. But the Tory party had always been more skeptical. They represented landed interests that bore much of the tax burden for the war. They were more sympathetic to the traditional monarchy and less enthusiastic about continental entanglements. And they increasingly questioned whether the endless bloodletting served English interests. By 1710, the Tories were winning the argument. Queen Anne, once devoted to Sarah Churchill, had grown tired of her domineering friend. The political wind shifted. Marlborough's enemies moved against him. In 1711, the Duke was dismissed from all his offices, accused of corruption and mismanagement. The architect of Allied victory was cast into political exile. The Tory government opened secret peace negotiations with France. This was, to the Dutch and the Austrians, a betrayal. England was abandoning its allies, seeking a separate peace that would leave them to face France alone. The coalition that had held together for a decade began to fracture. And then something happened that changed everything. The Archduke Charles's brother died. Emperor Joseph I of the Holy Roman Empire, the elder brother of Archduke Charles, died of smallpox on April 17, 1711. He had no sons. That meant Charles was now heir to the Austrian Habsburg domains and, upon election, would become Holy Roman Emperor. The war had been fought to prevent a single dynasty from controlling both France and Spain. But if Charles became both Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the same nightmare would occur just with Habsburgs instead of Bourbons. The ghost of Charles V's universal monarchy would be resurrected. Suddenly, the Allied war aim made no sense. Putting Charles on the Spanish throne would create exactly the kind of super-state the war was supposed to prevent. The English, Dutch, and even many Germans realized that an Austrian victory was no longer desirable. The negotiations accelerated. The peace that emerged was hammered out in the Dutch city of Utrecht over the course of 1712 and 1713, with additional treaties signed in Rastatt and Baden in 1714. The settlement was complicated, reflecting the complicated nature of the war itself. But the core outcome was clear. Philip V would remain King of Spain, but the Spanish Empire would be dismembered. France and Spain would remain permanently separate. Philip formally renounced any claim to the French throne, and the French and Spanish crowns could never be held by the same person. This was the fundamental Allied war aim, and it was achieved. But Spain lost its European empire. The Spanish Netherlands went to Austria. Milan went to Austria. Naples and Sardinia went to Austria. Sicily went to the Duke of Savoy. Spain retained only the Iberian Peninsula and its overseas colonies. The great European territories that had made Spain a continental power for 2 centuries were gone. France also lost territory, surrendering gains made during Louis XIV's earlier wars. But France itself remained intact, and the Bourbon dynasty remained on the French throne. Louis had been humbled, but not destroyed. England was arguably the biggest winner, though it was now Britain, following the 1707 Act of Union with Scotland. The treaty gave Britain Gibraltar and Minorca, controlling the entrance to the Mediterranean. It gave Britain extensive trading rights in Spanish America, including the Jacinto, the lucrative slave trade contract. It gave Britain territorial gains in North America, including Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and recognition of British sovereignty over Hudson Bay. Britain was emerging from the war as the dominant naval and commercial power in the world. The Dutch achieved security, the barrier fortresses in the Spanish Netherlands that would protect them from future French aggression. But they had exhausted themselves in the process. The Netherlands, which had been one of the great powers of the 17th century, would never fully recover its former position. Austria gained enormously in territory, but lost the prize it had fought for, the Spanish throne. Charles, now Emperor Charles VI, would nurse this grievance for decades, and Spain was diminished, carved up, reduced from a continental empire to a regional power. But it remained Bourbon. Philip V had won his throne. Against all the great powers of Europe, against a decade of war and invasion and occupation, he had held on. The Treaty of Utrecht didn't end all the fighting. Charles VI refused to accept the terms and continued the war alone against France through 1714, but without British or Dutch support, there was nothing he could achieve. Eventually, Austria made peace. The last echoes of the conflict took even longer to fade. In Spain itself, the civil war dimension of the conflict continued. Catalonia, which had supported Charles, held out against Philip V until September 1714, when Barcelona finally fell after a brutal siege. The victorious Philip stripped Catalonia of its traditional liberties and institutions, a grievance that Catalans remember to this day. But by 1715, the guns had finally fallen silent. Louis XIV, the Sun King, died in September of that year, having reigned for 72 years. He had survived to see his grandson secured on the Spanish throne, but at a cost that staggered the imagination. France was financially ruined, its population devastated by war and famine, its military reputation shattered. The Sun King's final years were marked not by glory, but by exhaustion. The War of Spanish Succession was over, nearly 14 years of continuous warfare. Battles on 4 continents, hundreds of thousands dead. And at the end of it all, a new European order had emerged, one that would shape the next century of history. What did it all mean? What had all that blood and treasure actually accomplished? On the surface, the answer seems straightforward. The war prevented a single power from dominating Europe. Neither the Bourbons nor the Habsburgs achieved the universal monarchy that everyone feared. The balance of power, that delicate equilibrium that European diplomats obsessed over, was preserved. But look deeper, and the War of Spanish Succession accomplished something far more significant. It fundamentally reshaped the international order in ways that would echo for centuries. The most obvious change was the rise of Britain. Before the war, England had been a significant power, but hardly a dominant one. France was the colossus, Spain still commanded respect, and the Dutch Republic was a commercial and naval superpower. England was important, but it was one player among several. After Utrecht, everything was different. Britain, now united with Scotland, emerged from the war as the supreme naval power in the world. The Royal Navy had grown dramatically during the conflict, and Britain's commercial interests had expanded even faster. Gibraltar gave Britain control of the Mediterranean gateway. The Jacinto gave British merchants access to the lucrative Spanish-American markets. Colonial gains in North America laid the foundation for future expansion. More importantly, Britain had discovered a strategic formula that would serve it for the next centuries. Maintain naval supremacy, avoid large continental commitments, and let other European powers exhaust themselves in land wars while Britain accumulated wealth and colonies. The war had been expensive, yes, but Britain's rivals had been weakened even more. The foundations of the British Empire were laid in the Peace of Utrecht. The path that would lead to global dominance, to an empire on which the sun never set, began here. For France, the war was a catastrophe that took generations to overcome. Louis XIV had gambled everything on the Spanish inheritance and had very nearly lost it all. Yes, his grandson sat on the Spanish throne. Yes, the Bourbon dynasty had expanded its reach, but the cost had been ruinous. France's population had declined by perhaps 2 million people during the war from battlefield casualties, from disease, from the devastating famine of 1709. The treasury was empty. The debt was astronomical. The great military machine that Louis had spent decades building was broken. The Sun King died just months after the peace, leaving behind a country exhausted beyond measure. His great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited a kingdom that would spend the next several decades simply recovering from the excesses of the previous reign, and the strategic situation had shifted against France permanently. Before the war, France had been able to bully its neighbors more or less at will. After the war, any French aggression would trigger an immediate coalition response. The balance of power system that emerged from Utrecht was specifically designed to contain France, and it worked. For the next century, France would find itself checked at every turn by alliances forming against it. The irony is that Louis XIV probably could have avoided most of this disaster. If he had accepted the partition treaties, if he had been more diplomatic after accepting Charles II's will, if he had not provoked England and the Dutch with unnecessary provocations, the war might never have happened. His grandson might have peacefully inherited Spain while France retained its strength. But Louis was Louis. He couldn't resist the grand gesture, the assertion of dominance, the dramatic statement of power. And it cost him everything. The Dutch Republic paid a different kind of price. The Netherlands had been one of the wonders of the 17th century, a small nation that had become a global commercial empire through sheer ingenuity, determination, and naval prowess. Dutch ships had dominated world trade. Dutch banks had financed European commerce. Dutch culture had produced Rembrandt and Vermeer and some of the finest minds of the age. The War of Spanish Succession broke the Dutch. Not immediately, and not completely. The Netherlands remained wealthy and influential for decades. But the war had drained Dutch resources to the breaking point. The country had fielded huge armies, far beyond what its small population could sustain. It had borrowed massively to finance the war effort. And at the end of it all, the Dutch found that they had been outpaced. Britain had emerged as the dominant commercial and naval power. The trade that had once flowed through Amsterdam now increasingly flowed through London. The financial innovations that the Dutch had pioneered were now being perfected by British bankers. The colonial empire that the Dutch had built was now being overshadowed by British expansion. The Dutch had won the war but lost the peace. They had helped create a new European order, and in that new order, they were no longer the leading commercial power. The Dutch Golden Age was over. What followed would be respectable decline, still wealthy, still important, but never again the dynamic force that had astonished the world. For Austria, the outcome was mixed. On one hand, the Habsburgs had gained enormously in territory. The Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, Sardinia, these were substantial additions to the Habsburg domains. Austria emerged from the war as one of the great powers of Europe, a status it would maintain for the next 2 centuries. On the other hand, Austria had failed in its primary objective. The Spanish throne had gone to the Bourbons. The centuries-long connection between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family was severed. And Spain itself, the prize everyone had fought for, was now permanently in the enemy camp. Emperor Charles VI never accepted this outcome. He spent the rest of his reign nursing grievances, attempting to recover what he considered his rightful inheritance, and eventually creating new problems by obsessing over the succession of his own daughter, Maria Theresa. The seeds of future wars were already being planted. But Austria's real problem was structural. It was a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire held together by dynastic loyalty rather than national feeling. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Croats, and dozens of other peoples all owed allegiance to the Habsburg crown, but they had little in common with each other. Managing this diversity would become increasingly difficult as the age of nationalism approached. The War of Spanish Succession gave Austria territory. It also gave Austria problems that would eventually destroy it. And what of Spain itself, the kingdom whose throne had sparked all this carnage? Spain emerged from the war diminished, but, in a strange way, clarified. The loss of the European territories was painful, but it also simplified things. Spain was no longer responsible for defending distant possessions in Italy and the Netherlands. It could focus on the Iberian Peninsula and on its vast American colonies. Philip V proved to be a reasonably capable king, importing French administrative methods and attempting to modernize the creaky Spanish bureaucracy. The new Bourbon dynasty brought new ideas and new energy to a country that had been stagnating under the final Habsburgs. But Spain would never again be what it had been. The empire that Charles V and Philip II had built that had dominated Europe for a century was gone. Spain remained wealthy, remained influential, remained important. But it was no longer a superpower. The age of Spanish dominance was over. The real irony is that Charles II el Hechizado, the bewitched, that tragic product of generations of inbreeding, had actually made the right choice. He had wanted to keep the empire intact, and he had chosen the heir most likely to achieve that. The French candidate, backed by French military power, had indeed held the core of the inheritance. The partition that Charles had feared was averted. Of course, the core that survived was much diminished from what Charles had ruled. And the war that resulted from his choice killed hundreds of thousands of people. But from a purely Spanish perspective, it could have been worse. The nightmare scenario, complete partition, total dismemberment, had been avoided. Perhaps that counts as success. Perhaps the war also left marks on places far from the great battlefields of Europe. In North America, the conflict known as Queen Anne's War had reshuffled territorial claims in ways that would matter enormously a few decades later. British gains in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Hudson Bay pushed French Canada into an increasingly defensive posture. The stage was being set for the final showdown between Britain and France in America, the French and Indian War that would eventually give Britain control of the entire continent. In the Caribbean, the war had shuffled colonial possessions and disrupted the slave trade, though the basic patterns of plantation economy continued. The Jacinto that Britain gained would prove enormously profitable and enormously evil, feeding the system of chattel slavery that would define the Americas for another century and a half. In India, the European powers were only beginning their penetration of the subcontinent. But the relative positions established during this period, Britain's commercial advantages, France's weakening position would shape the competition that eventually gave Britain control of the entire region. The War of Spanish Succession was not just a European war. It was the first true world war, a conflict that touched every inhabited continent, that reshaped trade patterns and colonial possessions across the globe. The world that emerged from Utrecht was more connected, more integrated, and more dominated by European power than the world that had existed before. Perhaps the most important legacy of the war was conceptual. The Peace of Utrecht established the balance of power as the fundamental organizing principle of European international relations. The idea was simple: no single power should be allowed to dominate the continent. If any nation became too strong, the others should ally against it. War was acceptable, even necessary, to prevent hegemony. This wasn't entirely new. European states had formed alliances against dominant powers before. But Utrecht made it explicit, made it a conscious policy, made it the basis of an international system. For the next century, European diplomacy would revolve around the balance of power. Alliances would shift constantly as diplomats worked to maintain equilibrium. Wars would be fought not for conquest or ideology, but simply to prevent any one power from getting too strong. It was a system of managed competition, of constant adjustment, of perpetual watchfulness. It was also, in its own bloody way, effective. From 1713 to 1789, no single power dominated Europe. France attempted comebacks and was checked. Austria and Prussia rose and competed without either achieving supremacy. Britain stood offshore, balancing, mediating, intervening when necessary. The system held. And then, of course, it collapsed. The French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte shattered the old balance of power so completely that it took another massive war and another peace conference to rebuild it. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 would explicitly model itself on Utrecht, trying to recreate that same balance, that same managed equilibrium. The principles established at Utrecht would influence international relations into the 20th century and, arguably, into our own time. The idea that hegemony is dangerous, that power must be balanced, that no single nation should dominate, these concepts trace back directly to the world that emerged from the War of Spanish Succession. There's a school of thought that argues the War of Spanish Succession was ultimately pointless. That all those deaths, all that destruction, achieved nothing that couldn't have been achieved through negotiation. That the partition treaties Louis XIV rejected were essentially the same as the final settlement, and if he had simply accepted them, a decade of war could have been avoided. There's some truth to this. The final outcome was, broadly speaking, a partition of the Spanish inheritance, exactly what the pre-war treaties had proposed. Philip V got Spain, but Spain lost its European territories. The balance of power was maintained. The feared Bourbon superstate never materialized. Couldn't this have been achieved without Blenheim, without Ramillies, without Malplaquet? Couldn't negotiation have accomplished what war accomplished, but without the rivers of blood? Perhaps, but this criticism misunderstands how international relations actually work. The partition treaties failed not because they were unreasonable, but because no one trusted anyone else to follow them. Louis XIV didn't trust the Allies to respect a negotiated settlement. The Allies didn't trust Louis to limit his ambitions. Everyone suspected everyone else of plotting to gain advantage. The war, terrible as it was, resolved these trust issues in the most brutal possible way. It demonstrated, conclusively, that France could not simply dominate Europe at will. It demonstrated that Britain, Austria, and the Dutch would fight rather than accept Bourbon hegemony. It established credibility through blood. This is the dark logic of international conflict. Sometimes wars happen not because negotiation is impossible, but because neither side believes the other will honor any agreement. Sometimes credibility can only be established through violence. Sometimes the only way to prove you will fight is to actually fight. The War of Spanish Succession was, in this sense, a war about credibility. And by the time it was over, everyone understood exactly where everyone else stood. The generation that fought the war left behind a world transformed. Marlborough, the brilliant Duke who had won victory after victory, spent his final years in political exile and declining health. He died in 1722, largely forgotten by the nation he had served. His legacy lived on in the tactics studied by military officers, in the palace he built at Blenheim paid for by a grateful nation before they turned against him, and in the distant descendant who would bear his name, Winston Churchill, who wrote a biography of his ancestor and would himself face a continental enemy threatening British survival. Prince Eugene continued serving the Habsburgs for another 2 decades, fighting Turks and French with the same aggression he had always displayed. He died in 1736, one of the last of the great captains of his age. Louis XIV died just months after the peace, his glory dimmed, his kingdom exhausted, but his dynasty secured on both the French and Spanish thrones. The Bourbon family he had fought to establish would rule France until the Revolution and Spain until, remarkably, the present day. The current king of Spain, Felipe VI, is a direct descendant of Philip V, the French prince who Louis placed on the Spanish throne 3 centuries ago, and Charles II, the poor bewitched king whose death started it all. He was largely forgotten, a footnote to the war he inadvertently caused. But his fate the product of generations of inbreeding, a living warning against the dangers of keeping power too closely held, perhaps carried its own lesson for the dynasties that fought over his inheritance. Blood matters, family matters, but concentrate them too tightly and you destroy what you're trying to preserve. Standing back from the War of Spanish Succession 3 centuries later, what strikes you most is how much of our modern world was shaped in those 14 years of carnage. Britain's rise to global dominance, which would eventually produce the largest empire in human history, which would spread the English language across the world, which would create the international order we still partially live within, accelerated dramatically because of this war. The path to American independence, to the world wars, to the current position of the United States as a superpower, all of it runs through Utrecht. The decline of the Netherlands, the exhaustion of France, the rise of Prussia, which gained strength during this period while its rivals weakened, the shape of the German states, the borders of Italy, all of this emerged from the settlements of 1713. Even the very concept of international order, the balance of power, the idea that hegemony must be prevented, the system of great power management that persisted into the 20th century was crystallized and formalized in the negotiations that ended this war. All because one inbred king couldn't produce an heir. History turns on such strange hinges. Vast consequences flow from seemingly small causes. The genetic catastrophe of the Spanish Habsburgs, the accumulated mutations of 2 centuries of cousin marriage triggered a war that killed hundreds of thousands and reshaped the globe. If Charles II had been healthy, if he had produced an heir, if the succession had been clear, none of it would have happened. No Blenheim, no Ramillies, no Malplaquet, no rise of Britain. Perhaps no British Empire, perhaps no American Revolution, perhaps a completely different world. But Charles was who he was. His body was what generations of inbreeding had made it. And when he died, the wolves descended. The War of Spanish Succession is sometimes called the First World War, not in the sense of the 20th century cataclysms, but in the sense of a truly global conflict, fought simultaneously on multiple continents, reshaping international order on a planetary scale. It was a war about power, about dynasties, about the eternal question of who gets to rule. But it was also a war about ideas, about balance, about sovereignty, about the limits that should be placed on ambition. And in the end, what it proved was something that every subsequent generation would have to learn again. That the international order is fragile, that power vacuums breed conflict, and that the death of one person, even a weak, broken, pitiable person like Charles II, can unleash forces that reshape the world. The guns fell silent in 1713, the treaties were signed, the borders were drawn, and Europe settled into a new equilibrium, exhausted but stable, blooded but at peace.